So I'm going to read in this article called The Scotsman, The Lost Edinburgh, the Great Plague of 1645. During the 17th century, the citizens of Edinburgh met with catastrophe as the Great Plague of 1645 left tens of thousands dead. Cases of the bubonic plague were ferociously common in Europe throughout much of the Middle Ages before fading away around 300 years ago. The epidemic, later labeled the Black Death, entered Italy in 1347 and spread quickly across the European continent. It was transmitted by the bite of infected fleas carried on the bodies of black rats. Now, we know that's a narrative and a lie. Some say it was spread by the wild man, aka the Caucasians from the Caucasus Mountains, or the Black Comet, or the Horrible Star, which it talks about in 2nd Esdras, chapter 15, verse 38 through 51. Those unfortunate enough to contract the virus face almost certain death within 3 to 4 days. During the 14th century, the pandemic saw a third of the population of Europe and Asia perish. The bubonic plague first ventured north in Hadrianwall in 1349, putting paid to the fallacious belief of many Scots at the time that it had been sent to the British Isles by the Almighty, purely to punish the transgressions of the English. Edinburgh and its nearby port at Leith suffered intermittently from the plague over the next few centuries. The overcrowded and unsanitary rat-infested conditions prevalent within the medieval city created the ideal environment for the lethal pathogen to thrive time and time again. The Great Plague of Edinburgh. The plague epidemic, which grasped Edinburgh in 1645, was without exception the most devastating the city ever experienced. It was estimated that up to half of the population died, while in Leith the percentage was even higher, perhaps due to the steady influx of ships all over Europe. Corpse-littered closes and local governments collapsed as the infested fell in their tens of thousands. Now, we know from one article I was reading from another YouTuber that 4 government officials died from the plague. It's quite interesting. Initial symptoms of the bubonic plague would appear very suddenly. Victims would begin to complain of a high fever after only a day or two, followed quickly by muscle cramps, gangrene, and painful swollen glands around the groin, neck, and armpits. Once contracted, disease was easily passed on and spread from host to host. Those infected with disease were either forbidden from leaving their homes or banished to quarantine huts outside the city walls in desperate attempts by authorities to separate the healthy from the ill. Plague doctors. In Edinburgh, as across Europe, a plague doctor visited contaminated properties on a daily basis. These new age medics were distinctively dressed in long leather cloaks, large brimmed hats, and grotesque beaked masks filled with smelling herbs. Doctors believed the herbs would repel the evil smells which were thought to carry the disease. I thought it was rats. One of the plague doctor's principal tasks was to pierce and drain the buboes, the pus-filled lymph nodes of the victims before they ruptured independently and became septic. The wound would then be cauterized with heated iron. All in all, it was an early unpleasant experience for the patient, who would more than likely die with or without treatment. Modern interpretations of the plague doctor's mask can be seen today at the annual Carnival of Venice. All right. The burial pits. To cope with the sheer number of dead bodies strewn across the city, massive burial pits were hastily dug at sites such as Berg, Mur, and Links. The extinct death toll was never recorded, but it was thought that close to 3,000 people died in Leith alone, roughly half of the port's population. Edinburgh population around this time was approximately 35,000. In 1647, the plague began to disappear from Edinburgh, never to return. The Great Plague of Marseille in 1720 proved to be the last significant bubonic plague outbreak in Europe. Scotland's capital would not suffer from pestilence on such a scale again until the worldwide cholera epidemic of the 1830s. Despite its 400-year absence from Edinburgh, the bubonic plague persists in other parts of the world, but advances in medical since the days of leather-cloaked physicians with herb field masks ensure the vast majority of those infected can now be effectively cured. That was quite an interesting read right there. Now I have this book, Ley Lines, and it says The Graves of Bessie Bell and Mary Cray. Recently, I went to a remote location in the hills near Methven, Perthshire, to find the graves of Bessie Bell and Mary Gray, who fled from the bubonic plague in 1645 and built a little bower on the banks of the river Almond. England lost 9/10 of its population then, and Scotland 1/3, while nearby Perth almost 3,000 people died. All right. For a short time, they stayed in their home hut at the confluence of the river Almond and the Burn until their food ran out, forcing them to eat black snails until Bessie's lover visit, bearing food and a pearl necklace. Some say a silk handkerchief brought from a beggar who had taken it from one of the many corpses left lying in the streets of Perth. When Bessie put on the necklace, Mary, it is said, clapped her hands in delight. A short time later, they both contracted the plague and died in each other's arms. Later, their bodies were carried to this spot by cleansers, those unfortunate tasked with the disposal of the plague victims, until they discovered that the terrified villagers would not let them take the bodies to the graveyard at Methven and had to leave them lying above ground, based foreigners facing the sun, until centuries later the tiny burial ground was built around them. When I checked this little burial with my divine rod or sticks, I could find, even almost 400 years, a very weak black spiral emitted from the site, which unwound and led me back through the ancient forest to the site of their little hut, deep along the trees. Beside these sad graves lay a stone inscribed, "They lived, they loved, they died, but it is now disappeared." Their names do live on, however, as later 2 stagecoaches named after them ran from Creth to Perth. The Scottish settlers in Ireland designated 2 mountains in their name. In Newton Stewart, County Tyrone, Ireland, on the A5, 2 hills called Bessie Bell and Mary Cray face each other across the road. Other settlers in the USA named 2 mountains after them in Shenandoah Valley, Virginia. Even in New Zealand, there are 2 adjacent volcanic cones in Auckland Volcanic Field, Alteria Hill, and Green Hill, bearing their names. It is odd that their names have been almost forgotten in the village where they lived. Upon closing, I like to say that history repeats itself. There's nothing new under the sun. I say that a lot because it's just so evident, through the annals of history, with the bubonic plague, the Black Death, the Black Comet, and a lot of death happening in that time period. But also, with the quarantine and people staying in the houses, we think this is new because we've never experienced this. But in all actuality, they did it in the past. We're just repeating a cycle, in a sense. Or a reset, one might say also, that's taking place around the world. But peace and shalom.